Hello and welcome to Hiring, Firing, and Hierarchies. Oh my. My name is Dr. Max Libaran. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the director of Clear Lab, which is a lab based at Memorial University on the island of Newfoundland, which are the homelands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. And this is Jess.
Hi, I'm Jess Melvin. I am the outgoing lab manager here at Clear. My pronouns are she, her, and this is Melissa.
Hi everyone, my name is Melissa Morgan, and as Jess mentioned, I'm our incoming lab manager. And in this workshop today, we're going to be talking about the role of hierarchies in our lab, how we choose lab members, and some of the best practices that we've developed over 10 years.
So Clear Lab's specific concept of what is good, or what our concept of justice is based in good land relations. And the core values that organize our work are humility, accountability, and collectivity. These values and our specific idea of justice guide us in making all of our other decisions, including how we hire, fire, and practice hierarchy. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about hierarchy. For us, hierarchy is about identifying accountability and responsibility in uneven power relations. And as a professor in a lab, there are always uneven power relations. There is already hierarchy, and that's not a choice I get to make. Professors have more power than students. Men have more power than women and other gender minorities in an academic setting. And so we own this unevenness and deal with it really explicitly through hierarchy. So hierarchy isn't just a tool by which you can yield power and abuse power. It's also a tool of identifying different areas of accountability and responsibility. So in Clear, we actually have a very narrow or shallow accountability or hierarchical system. I, as the principal investigator or the director of the lab, I have the most accountability and responsibility to everyone in the lab and our partners, everything that comes out of the lab. Below me are the two lab managers who we'll be hearing about today. We usually only have one, but we're in transition. They deal with sort of interacting with individual lab members and making sure those lab members are in a good place, but they're also responsible for the entire lab in terms of personnel. I'm responsible to the entire labs in terms of everything. And then after that, it's flat, and other lab members are accountable to themselves, each other, and their colleagues. So one of the ways that managers and directors in our hierarchy are accountable to the whole lab is in terms of who comes in, who doesn't come in, and how we make those decisions. So hiring and firing. So over time, we've built a safer space in our lab for people who wouldn't normally find themselves in a science lab. And so that means our very inclusive lab is also extremely exclusive. It is not radically inclusive. Not everyone can come in. Saying no is always also saying yes to something else. So saying no to people who are transphobic is a way of saying yes to trans rights, for example, in our lab. And so the question becomes, how do we assign our yeses and nos, especially for a justice-oriented value-based lab? And Jess will talk to you a bit about that.
Thanks, Max. So I will talk about how we bring diverse points of view into the hiring decisions here at Clear. So typically we hire by a hiring committee. So last round of hiring, it was who you see here, myself, Max, and Melissa. And what this means is that reviewers on the committee will read applications from different points of view, and they'll naturally look for different kinds of red and green flags, which we'll talk more about shortly. And it's also important in the hiring committee here at Clear that those different people are not only coming from different backgrounds and different ways of thinking, but are also at different points in the hierarchy. And what this offers is not just training for those who have less experience in the hiring practices, but it also allows people from different points of the hierarchy who have different responsibilities, different day-to-day interactions with employees and with the movements in the lab to really spot those things in applications that someone with a different responsibility at a higher point in the hierarchy or a lower point in the hierarchy may not notice. naturally. At the end of our individual review, we will then compile our reviews of applications together so that everyone on the hiring board can see how our interpretation of the different applications may have differed, and then talk about why that may be. So I'll hand it over to Melissa now to talk about that kind of collating of our reviews together.
Thank you, Jess. So one helpful way that we find is productive to help us see what each member of the committee is thinking is by ranking the applications according to a green, yellow, red color spectrum, particularly the cover letters. So you can see this in the spreadsheet behind me. Green applications are typically the ones that we are all confident on interviewing. So these typically discuss clear values with a lot of vibrance and experience. So in other words, not just copy pasting what's in the job advertisement. Yellow applications are very middly. So with these, it's quite hard to get a feel for things. I apologize. So they might try to address multiple things, but maybe each time just scope the tip of the iceberg in each attempt and not really get into the nitty-gritty of it. And red applications are hard-nosed. So they typically don't address clear values at all, or if they do, they are ruled out by other red flags that we'll discuss later. So if you were to see this whole spreadsheet, you would notice that I, as a newcomer to the hiring process, have a lot more yellows than Jess and Max. And sometimes this arises from some self-guilt and wanting to give people the benefit of the doubt. Apologies. So it helps to remember that if they're yellow at their best presentation in a job interview or in a job application, then they're probably oranges to red in day-to-day presentation. So one thing that Max suggested to me is to reflect on whether I would actually like to work with that person in the lab. And if the answer is no, or if I have a long pause before I give an answer, they're probably a red application as opposed to a yellow. So we'll talk more about clear values and examples of what makes a green or red candidate in a minute.
So one of the so we're going to talk about some red flags that we see in applications. And first of all, it's really important to note that because we hire on values and not skills, we foreground cover letters, not resumes. So sometimes we won't even get through. If we get through the cover letter, we might already see enough flags that we don't bother doing the CVs. For some very entry-level positions, CVs are very supplementary to the cover letter because they might not have any experience related to science, which is what we do. So we're going to talk about some of the uncommon red flags. I think people sort of intuitively know what a common red flag might be, but we're going to talk some about some that relate to justice or value-based stuff. And these all come from mistakes we've made so that you don't have to make them. The first one is, actually this one was kind of easy to see, but not if you have a really mixed committee, which is fetishism, racial fetishism. And for us, it's usually Indigenous fetishism. So we have an Indigenous run lab. Sometimes we'll get covers that are like, I love Indigenous people. They're so beautiful. I want to get in there with you and like get my toes rubbed in your stuff. And you're just like, whoa, that's not okay. So there's this sort of like it's an essentialization in a joyous, sort of toxic, optimistic kind of way. The flip, there's something also very similar that we call over-identification with the lab. We learned this the hard way. Someone talks a really good justice game, but also they talk a lot in their cover letter about how they've been looking for a lab like this their entire life. And once they join, sort of all of their wishes, dreams will be fulfilled and they'll finally be able to flourish. We've started calling that over-identification because no lab can be all things, all perfect justice, and it goes really sideways when it turns out the person's in a lab with normal, real people. Jess will cover a couple of others.
Another one that we keep an eye out for is something called benevolent deficit filling. So this usually in an application will look like talking about communities or groups as lacking knowledge or lacking something about their own environment, and then explaining as a need for academics to come in as a bit of a savior or to provide what's missing, or to educate them. Melissa, do you want to take over with the next one?
Thank you, Jess. So another one is conflation of the lab values. So in the job advertisements, the values that CLEAR really exemplifies are actually emboldened for the candidate to address in their cover letter. And they're also invited to familiarize themselves with the website and the lab book to see what these values mean to CLEAR. So sometimes people will conflate textbook definitions of values or make a one-to-one comparison between what is conventionally meant by something and extrapolate that to CLEAR. So this can be like saying submissiveness and modesty is the same as humility, whereas you learn that that's not the case when you familiarize yourself with CLEAR. And this ties really well with not being very reflective. So this means that we can't really see the candidate's own thought in the values that they're discussing. So sometimes if the application is AI generated or just has values copy pasted from the job ad, it's very hard to see the person in them, and it's very one-dimensional in that sense. Pass it over to Jess.
Another potential red flag would be someone that says a lot about what they want from the lab, but not anything about what they can give to the lab. So CLEAR does offer quite a different environment than most scientific labs. And I think it's only natural that a desire to be a part of that or to benefit from that would come out in an application. But it is CLEAR as a collective, and it is very important to us that the applicant can express how they can meaningfully contribute to that collective. So even if this is something that is absent on a cover letter, that's okay if we can bring it out after some prompting in an interview. And I think that kind of lends into what Max will talk a little bit about now, of being generous in how we look for red flags. So I'll hand it over to Max.
Yeah, so there are some showstopper red flags, fetishism, deficit, that sort of stuff, which will just put you in the no pile. But also, we need to be really aware that, especially in a value-based or justice-based lab, a lot of folks are not yet articulate in those vocabularies or those movements. And so, for instance, if we used to identify as a feminist lab, explicitly as a feminist lab, and there are international students from countries where there's no such thing as feminism. So we can't dock those folks, or even other people who are seeped in patriarchy or in other things, for not being able to give a definition of feminism or be really acquainted with it. So what we try and look for is the intuition that someone is aware of power structures, they're aware that they're in them, they're aware that they're maybe structural. So even if they say it's unfair and it's always unfair, you're like, well, fairness is a pretty loose term, but you got it, like you're in the zone. And so we'll invite those folks in for an interview and then do a lot of prompting to feel our way through. So now Melissa is going to talk a little bit about some of the hiring practicalities, how we actually do this. Mm-hmm.
So one thing that we think is really important is to recognize that as part of our accountability to the lab, the hiring committee is not isolated from the rest of the lab. So for example, if a lab member knows that someone is applying and has some feedback, we welcome it and we keep their judgment in mind. And if it's positive judgment, great. We look forward to the application. And if it's more critical, it can be really helpful to highlight those things that an applicant might not include in their application because they're on their best behavior. So a lab's apprehension for an applicant is usually evidenced in their application anyway. So it typically does match with what their conscience tells us. I'll hand it over to Jess to discuss some more.
Another important practicality for us would be that we always provide the interview questions in advance for anyone that we offer an interview to. So we give those to them in an email days ahead of the interview when we're scheduling it. These interview questions are also provided in the resource package. But basically, what we want to do is we want to see people at their best. We want to, even the playing field as much as we possibly can. So if you're an introvert, if people who are different thinkers or whose first language is in English, we want to give them the time to prepare. And if they want to come into an interview and just read a script, that is more than okay. We read a script as well when we're asking them the questions. So we find that it takes a little bit of the pressure off. I'll pass it over to Max.
So over time, we've really honed down on our interview questions. We've spent about 10 years refining them. And they're the ones we have now we feel are really good for sussing out values. So for instance, our first question is now, how does where you're from, broadly defined, impact how you do research? Or if you haven't done research, how you collaborate? And that opens up, that just really, like, people can talk about community, they can talk about collaboration, they can talk about values, they can talk about place-based work, they can talk about land relations, because land relations is a primary way we think about justice. And we've provided these questions, as Jess said, in the resource package. And we only really ask 4 questions now, 4 or 5. And the last one is always, what questions do you have for us? Not, do you have questions for us? So these little subtle changes in wordings we find has really helped interviewees, especially because we interview a lot of folks where this is their first job. And so there's some structure into these questions. And Melissa, why don't you sort of do the last part of this?
Thanks, Max. So in the interview stages, I have discovered through some helpful feedback from Max and Jess that neutral to smiley expressions and nods are really, really helpful. So they come naturally when a candidate is hitting all the right targets. But on the other hand, there's a lot of disapproving looks, which I am guilty of doing unconsciously sometimes, can really discourage applicants from answering fully and sort of stop them in their tracks. And so that leaves us, the hiring committee, wanting for full context. So I know that I will always rather a green or red flag stare me right in the face than sort of just fade it off in the distance. So in either case, whether a candidate is interviewing really well or not, just letting them explore their responses in full assures you that when you're at the decision table, assumptions don't dominate the decisions you're making. You have a lot of context to work with. So I'll hand it over to Jess to talk about protocols for leaving the lab.
Thanks, Melissa. So we've covered quite a bit here about how we bring people into the lab. So I'm going to talk a little bit about decision-making processes and when it comes time for people to leave the lab. So one way that happens would be through letting a contract lapse. We typically hire new employees on a single semester contract with a renewal available at the end. And this just helps us to ensure that the employee is able to do the job that they're hired for and contribute meaningfully to the collective. So if one or both of these things are not happening, we may choose not to renew the contract at the end of that semester. So part of a manager's role is to determine when to end someone's employment. Max will talk a little bit about firing, but basically part of my job as a lab manager is to identify early on if a person is struggling in the role that they were hired for. So this will look different for different roles in the lab, but an example of this would be a lab technician who is hired for processing might show signs of not meeting quality assurance benchmarks or not showing a gradual improvement in sample processing times as training progresses. And my job is to really monitor for those signs and then use regular check-ins to keep monitoring for them, and when they show up, to provide structured supports to help the technician meet their goals and the goals of the position. So these supports will look different for different technicians, but they could look something like additional one-on-one training sessions, or providing a very clear timeline of benchmarks that should be met with an added rubric or task management structure to help them meet those benchmarks. We always do our best to accommodate and support everyone to do the best work that they can in a way that works for them. But if an employee doesn't really take advantage of the supports, or they're not helping them meet the goals of the position, then often we will change the role to suit the person for the rest of that contract. And then we may make the decision to let the contract lapse at the end, depending on the needs of the lab. So Max will talk about the rare alternative to letting a contract lapse.
And Jess makes it sound like we always end contracts because someone can't fulfill the position. The number one reason we let a contract lapse is because someone doesn't actually finish their position. They don't use their hours, they ghost us, they decide that jobs are really hard and they don't want one now, that kind of stuff. So Jess is talking about things that are in our control. Jess mostly talked about technical reasons someone would leave the lab. There's also social problems. So as the head of the hierarchy, shit rolls uphill to me, and I am the only person who decides firing. And firing means stopping someone in the middle of a contract. And this also includes, actually, Jess talked about technical issues and the structures we put around helping people with technical issues. There's also social issues when people are not good at the values of the lab, or not good at the safer space sort of parts of the lab. The same thing happens. We stop and put some structures together, do some one-on-one. And the only way you can get fired and clear is if you've made a mistake or caused harm. You're given a structure to be accountable and change those things, and you don't. We've had many, many instances where people have made expensive, harmful mistakes, but we have only ever fired one person in the 10-year history of the lab. So if you are in the position where firing or even ending a contract might be on the table, there's a few very important things to do. The first is excruciatingly clear communication with the person. The structuring that Jess was talking about, one-on-one meetings. Can you tell me what's going on? Why is this wrong? Let's figure out what's going wrong. Why? This sort of stuff. Can you name the harm that's happening? Can you name the problem that's going on? How are we going to change them? What are the 3 steps? What are the timelines for those steps? Who's going to check in on those steps? All of that being very clear and documented, usually use email, so that if it does come to firing someone, there's a very clear trail to do it. And all of their rights as an employee have been clearly met, and all, those sort of things. Now, this clear is unique in that we have lots and lots of staff positions and fewer than maybe average, whatever that might be, graduates positions. You cannot fire a graduate student. Well, you can, but you should not fire a graduate student. What we do instead is if that person has caused harm and needs to, and isn't being accountable to it, I just remove them from the lab setting. They're still my student. I still do their advisement, but they're not part of the lab collective. And then we work on what it would mean to join that collective if they can join that collective. And in all cases, whether someone's held out as a graduate student, fired, or had their contract lapse, there was always the possibility of letting people back in if they can show strong accountability and sort of realignment with the lab values and techniques. And that has happened a few times, that people have come back after exiting the lab. So that's hiring, firing, and hierarchies. We hope that has been helpful. Everything we've covered, we've learned over 10 years of trial and error. So we hope you do not have to make some of the errors we did after following this. We've also put together a bundle of resources for you, interview questions that are annotated about what we get out of them, and some old interview questions and why we don't use them anymore, a spreadsheet template for hiring pools, and keeping track of things, example of job ads that show how we put our values into recruitment at the very start, and of course, this recording. These resources are on the CLEAR website at civiclaboratory.nl, as well as the IndigeLab Network websites. So thank you very much, and very best wishes on building and maintaining your justice-oriented lab.